Horatio said was, how can a man die better than facing fearful odds?
Bro! Get inside! Get inside!
For the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods.
I created you, Jack. I am your god.
Fuck you, Sally.
That is certainly a good way to die, sticking it to the demiurge known as Sally. But a life of heresy, a service of heresy, is also a good way to die, to avoid oblivion. Why is that? As I always say, heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just is. Welcome with kindness and love to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. Welcome so much to that dream of you, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria through the God above God.cam. Welcome so much this late June, the year of our Demiurge 2016. I am Abraxas, in his meat space incarnation of Miguel Connor. Our topic this week is Mythos and Cosmos, with our guest, John Lundwall. But first, please allow my introduction so you can understand the ethos of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio.
You're not the first person who's ever dreamt it.
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything. In the end, you must find the mystery that works for you and only you. Don't be the change you want to see in the world, as it's attributed to Gandhi, but be the strange you want to see in the world. Divided we stand, together we rise. We are not bigoted, but simply prefer to stereotype, because that is noetic aspartame for the political correct rulers of this age. We are not against any ideology or faith, but the literalist, bigoted, and, quote, my way or the die way spectrums of any ideology or faith. And we're certainly against New Age captains of commerce and SpongeBob occult movements. We're against what the internet has become now that its golden age is over. A den of misinformation vipers and corporate Sadducees. If you meet the Buddha on Facebook, block his fat ass, because you won't find any awakened ones in some self-anointed Messiah's fan page.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it. Were you listening to me, Neo?
We unquestionably define ourselves also by what we're for. Virtue, individuality, free choice and free thought, and higher states of being. All with the quote, your mileage may vary, stamp on them. Perhaps most of all, we're defined by our radioactive imagination. How we create better than the God of this world and that shitty art in heavenly places. Riffing from St. Paul in Ephesians. We're defined by our quest for surfing the charge and redemptive energies of Baphomet, Lucifer, Dionysus, Abraxas, Hecate, and the other unfinished gods we're building together. Those deities of transformation and transcendence from death. We want freedom, in the end, to create so many wonders, and those wonders will fully awaken us from this cosmic bad dream, this Xerox universe, and allow us to help others wake up to their authentic natures.
As Hemingway said, there is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self.
A Nazi once said that he joined the party to become, quote, free from freedom. That's what the boondoggling establishment wants for us in the end. And there are those New Agers and lukewarm Christians who think they can converse, feel, and project themselves into any kind of freedom. Or as George Orwell said, the more people chant about their freedom and how they are free, the more loudly I hear their chains rattling.
Freedom is life's great lie. Once you accept that, in your heart, you will know peace.
One of the chief ways we've discussed in many shows on how to access the nuclear power of your divine spark is through the power of myth. As I've said, myth is the language of the spirit, that public dream and projection of the imaginal world of archetypes. That place where facts are not that necessary, but meaning is unbridled. Or as Carl Jung said, meaning makes a great many things endurable, perhaps everything. No science will ever replace myth, and myth cannot be made out of any science. For it is not that God is a myth, but that myth is the revelation of a divine life in man.
Need some kind of hero.
Then be a hero, don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them. No man can walk out on his own story.
Or maybe not, or entirely not, my beloved truth seekers. Maybe, in the Gnostic sense of innovation and deconstruction, we need a paradigm change, which will allow us to mainline the power of myth better. That is what will be offered by this week's Astral guest. As mentioned, that is John Lundwall, who materializes at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his book, Mythos and Cosmos, Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age. This is one of the best books I've read in years on the study of mythology. It reminded me very much of the work of my dear deceased friend, Acharya S. And in fact, John uses the word astrotheology. As companions, I also would recommend April DeConnick's The 13th Apostle and Gordon White's Starships. Mythos and Cosmos re-examines ancient myth through the template of oral thinking and oral cosmology, contradicting decades of assumptions about the purpose and function of ancient mythology. And that includes making the iconic works of Joseph Campbell and Jung seem a bit outdated. As John himself says, the study of mythology is about the historicity of the eternal present.
What we doing live echoes in eternity.
I highly recommend this work, and your spiritual uterus will be blown away after the interview. Or your soul back guarantee. John is a PhD in mythological studies from Pacifica Graduate Institute in Carpinteria, California. He has presented numerous lectures at symposiums, conferences, and public classes in myth studies, and has served as an editor for several academic publications. For more information on John, please visit cosmosandlogos.com. That is cosmosandlogos.com. Please support Aeon Byte in any way you can. If you find value in this or any content, consider becoming a weekly supporter either through patreon.com or PayPal or even the USA Mail. Or just go to our Amazon wish list at thegodabovegod.com. Your funding solely keeps this Red Pill cafeteria open. All it takes is a shekel each show from each one of you, and this venture can thrive. Much appreciation to you crazy diamonds who keep the lights of the pleroma on every week.
If we have souls, they are made of the love we share. Undimmed by time, unbound by death.
Oh, I've seen comments on YouTube wondering why the alien god of the Gnostics doesn't do anything about the lower gods, including Jehovah, and the suffering they impart on this universe. As Jeremy Puma wrote in this way, there is the good god of the Gnostics and the all-powerful god known by many names. Their abilities are different. Furthermore, the alien god, who encompasses the aeons, is pure, creative, and transformative information. The plasmate Philip K. Dick wrote about. Information does not touch matter, as light doesn't really touch a balloon, borrowing from Jung's 7 Sermons to the Dead. Information and matter are two infinities that never truly intermingle, and this information, the essence of the alien god of the Sethians, is to awaken, instruct, and comfort you. Not avoid those cancerous cells, inflate your bank account, or get you laid by Hope Solo or Ronaldo. Keep that in mind. In Gnosticism, you are saved not by faith, but by information. Grace is the deliverance from ignorance.
I know what you're trying to do.
I'm trying to free your mind, Neo. But I can only show you the door. You're the one that has to walk through it.
The Archons control matter completely, and nothing you or Elon Musk or Hillary or Donald Trump or anyone will ever change that. Temporality is this universe. And in the end, it is pure torture unless you are bathed with the gratitude of Hagia Sophia.
You no trouble. Me, fifth element. Supreme being.
Let us do the interview with John Lundwall on his great book, Mythos and Cosmos. And if you feel, after this little introduction, my Pandoric drivel, that you're not an artist, nor an inventor, nor a mystic, that you don't know if you can write your own gospel or live your own myth, think of the words of Carl Jung, who said, "But if you have nothing at all to create, then perhaps you create yourself." Hello and goodbye, you modern-day Tom Sawyers, your mind not for rent by any god or government. Catch the mystery, catch the drift, catch the mist, catch the myth.
To realize that all your life, not all your love, all your hate, all your memory, all your pain, it was all the same thing. It was all the same dream, a dream that you had inside a locked room. A dream about being a person. And like a lot of dreams, there's a monster at the end of it.
soundbite interview. And with us, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by John Lundwall to discuss his book, Mythos and Cosmos, Mind and Meaning in the Oral Age. How are you doing today, John?
Good. Great to be on your show, Miguel.
Oh, it's wonderful having you on, and thank you for making the time. So let's talk first about the problem with mythology. You write in your book that the study of myth is, quote, about the historicity of the eternal present. But it seems a lot of scholarship on mythology has been a bit off. What are some of the problems, John?
Well, what I mean by that statement is the study of mythology. It's about the historicity of the eternal present. That is, our modern theories of ancient myth are modern ideologies projected onto the past. So whenever, there's scores of different theories of what ancient mythology was, and I have to say the classical Greeks could not even agree on the meaning of Greek myth. Right? Some of them thought they were histories. Some of them thought they were allegories for the natural sciences. Some of them applied them to initiation rituals. So by classical Greek times, many of the Greek myths were already being argued over. So this is mythology is a very ancient remnant of an oral tradition, an oral language that, like Linear B, there is no perfect translation of it, and all we can do is argue our modern theoretical constructs about it. So, that remains hugely problematic.
And why don't we talk about some of the, as you might say, I'm saying right now, the misfires that we have as people project onto the past. We have the howlers, the romantics, and the conspirators. Could you explain a bit about those, John?
Yeah. In my introduction, I kind of introduce a typology of just the interpretation of history and myth that I encounter most often at conferences and talking to people with it. And I do name them. The first group I call the howlers, and that is, it sounds like a pejorative, and maybe it's a little poke in the eye, but, in the mid-1960s, there's an astronomy professor from Boston University, Gerald Hawkins. He wrote a book called Stonehenge Decoded. And in it, he proposed that the standing stones at Stonehenge were a sort of ancient computer. They could calculate seasonal cycles with alignments with the sun and moon. Well, this flew in the face of everything that scholars believed in the 1960s, and the leading British archaeologist, Richard Atkinson, wrote an article called Moonshine on Stonehenge, where he rebuffed Gerald Hawkins, and in it he writes, "We all know that the builders of Stonehenge were nothing but a bunch of howling barbarians," end quote. And so this idea of the howlers is very common. It's deeply rooted in modern consciousness. It is subconscious. We just assume everyone in the ancient past was primitive, that they did not think sophisticated thoughts. They could not think sophisticated thoughts. They were not as evolved physiologically, biologically, mentally, intellectually, and so there were a bunch of primitives living in caves or in grass huts and spent all their life trying to chase game and eat, and so eventually we evolved past that. So that is one historical point of view. Huge problem with that point of view, by the way, and that is reality. If you just look at Stonehenge, first off, Gerald Hawkins was right. Richard Atkinson was wrong. Gerald Hawkins was right. And once people understood, oh my goodness, these stones really are aligned to the rising and setting sun of equinox and solstices, they started looking elsewhere at megalithic sites, and they started finding these alignments everywhere. So this was a template of architecture and thinking in the megalithic age. And, now they've discovered remnants of henges dating back to 5000 BCE, hundreds of them throughout Europe. And so this is an ancient architectural design, and back to the stones of Stonehenge, just putting that together, the stones were transported, 150 miles away. They had to be transported. They had to be cut and carved. They had to be lifted and positioned. All of this was predicated upon a social order. There had to be a social organization in order to do it. Why they did it? Well, there's all kinds of arguments as to why they did it, but that belays a philosophy, a theology, a cosmology. In other words, the people who built Stonehenge were just like you and I, Miguel, just like you and I. There were differences. They had different metaphysics. They had different ideas of the universe, different languages. They were oral, and that's the biggest difference. But intellectually, they're just like you and I, same hardware running on slightly different software. So, that's the Howlers. I named two other historic points of view, the Romantics and the Conspirators. And just real quickly, the Romantics are people who believe in a primitive past, but they believe everyone in the primitive past was ultra-spiritual, that they were connected with the landscape, that they, thought better thoughts than us. and so no one ever, seems to come up with the idea that ancient peoples were just like us. They're either worse than us or better than us. And so, the romantic view is also very popular. It's it's popular amongst feminist academic circles where we read that for thousands of years matriarchies ruled the planet and everyone lived in peace and harmony. Everywhere we dig archaeologically, there's signs of violence. Sadly, that is our nature. And then the conspirators are the people who insist that the aliens built the pyramids. People in the past were also primitive, and so they come across all these remarkable structures and astronomically aligned temples and caves and stones, and they say, well, the aliens must have done it. So those are the kind of the three, there are other points of view, but I run into these constantly with people, but also in reading. They fill volumes of popular literature, and subconsciously they underwrite a lot of academic thought. So, I start with my book by saying, here are these ideas, and being that the ancient past has disappeared, we can't reconstruct it, especially when there's very little writing to reconstruct it. I'm talking about the hoary past. So I myself have to go off some assumptions, just like everyone else, and I state up front, my assumption about peoples in the ancient past is not that they were stupider than us or more spiritually attuned than us, that for the most part they were just like us, and that the fundamental differences we see in the ancient past as opposed to the modern present resides in really the epistemology that results in orality. 99% of human history exists without writing. People did not read or write. This has huge consequences. How do you pass down your philosophy, your theology, your architectural, your science, your cultural traditions with no writing? How do you build megalithic sites? You think there would be blueprints and plans with no writing, right? So this is a colossal intellectual task, by the way, to pass down this information without writing. And human beings did it for thousands of years. And so orality, people without writing, have certain abilities we have lost, incredible abilities of memory, but also they have keen limitations. Oral peoples cannot create modern science. They cannot build a microchip. They cannot build an iPhone or launch a rocket. Those things take generations of fixed print, a printing press, a literate society, a vertical knowledge system with thousands of layers of information. Oral people simply cannot produce that. But oral peoples did produce the pyramids, and that should cause us to pause and think, rethink history, in my opinion.
And someone like Joseph Campbell, I believe you would put him, and Joseph Campbell and the other Jungians who thought that the ancients could just draw upon this wonderful world of archetypes and so forth, they would be part of the Romantics, right? I think you write, John, that Joseph Campbell said myth is misread as biography, history, and cosmology. But don't you in your book argue the exact opposite?
I do. I should note here that I got my graduate degree from Pacifica Graduate School, which is the Joseph Campbell School of Myth. While the professors taught many theories of myth, they preferred this Campbell Jungian idea of myth and religion in ancient history. And, I soon began deconstructing that while I was there. In my book, I cite Campbell throughout my book, and I talk about Campbell as a source. But ultimately, I disagree with Joseph Campbell. Campbell does write in Hero with a Thousand Faces that myth is psychology misread as history and biography and cosmology, and I write the exact opposite. Myth is exactly history, biography, and cosmology, underwritten by an oral psychology, which we have forgotten. Look, I love reading Joseph Campbell, and I love reading Carl Jung. And sadly, they are on the periphery of American culture and academia. Freud got all the credit in American academia. Jung is cited sometimes. And to me personally, I think that should have been the other way around. I think Freud's ideas were bizarrely neurotic, and I think Jung was much closer to the truth. But the bottom line is, the problem with Campbell's theory of myth, which is a common problem with any theory of myth, is you can't disprove it. You can take any story and apply Campbell's methodology to it and prove that it comes from the unconscious, and so there's very little differentiation between the Epic of Gilgamesh and Star Wars. And so as a result, I personally have a problem with that. Lots of academia has a problem with that. So it's the psychological school of myth carries that problem with it.
The monomyth.
The monomyth. Yes. Right. That's correct. So all myths can be described using this cookie cutter press. So that's I like Campbell and Jung. I think they have contributed enormously to the subject of psyche. But for me, mythology is something different. I approach it as a relic, a cultural artifact that is not just psychological, but primarily linguistic and cognitive. So I'm a different kind of structuralist than Campbell.
And the other problem, as you point out in your book, John, is that mythologists are stuck in the Darwinian model. They're simply adding more stuff, and we're sort of putting along throughout time, which is not what oral people did. Right. This is what absolutely destroys the howling point of view. Oral people without writing, actually had to invent writing. Well, it turns out writing is probably the greatest invention in human history. It is greater than the microchip and the iPhone, simply because it changes absolutely everything, and oral peoples had to do that. This is an intellectual task, equal with the Platos and the Keplers and the Galileos and the Einsteins, and it was done in ancient history, and by people about which we know absolutely nothing. So that tells us that ancient oral peoples, at least some of them, were highly sophisticated thinkers and innovators. And of course, they also domesticated animals and crops and metallurgy and architecture. And Greek philosophy doesn't appear ex nihilo. It's predicated on older mythological systems,
which just tells us that there's probably aspects of these mythological systems we've completely lost and misunderstood. And so there is this Darwinian view of history. I think it's probably one of the worst things that's ever been applied to our history books, which, we just assume that people living at 50,000 BC were pre-rational, pre-human almost, living in caves. Everyone was sitting around waiting for someone to come up with a thought. And I just reject this. My thinking is this. Let's remove that assumption. Let's remove that Darwinian idea of intellectual evolution, at least 50,000, going back 50,000 years. What does history look like if we remove that? And we get really kind of a shocking, perhaps different consideration and picture of history.
As you point out, John, if, let's say, you and I or some genius like Elon Musk was transported 10,000 years ago, we wouldn't last 2 days in any sort of culture anywhere. They weren't that stupid. We wouldn't survive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, intelligence, Miguel, my definition of intelligence is this. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems, right? So if you are able to solve problems of a significant kind, more than you create, then generally you're an intelligent person or an intelligent society. I ask you, does modern society solve more problems of a significant nature more than it creates? You could argue that there are many aspects of modern civilization that are not intelligent at all, and I think that should be obvious. But this is human nature. So if a modern historian were transported back 30,000 years and living within the metaphysics and culture of ancient tribal peoples, one, we wouldn't be able to survive more than 2 days because we have no idea how to survive. I get my food at the grocery store. I don't know about you. Actually, I get my food through the drive-through window. I think the grocery store's on its way out. So these people had to invent agriculture. Agriculture just doesn't appear out of nature. The cow doesn't appear out of nature. It has to be bred into existence. The apple doesn't appear into nature. It has to be bred into existence. People had to do that. Well, I have no idea how to do that. Most people in the modern world has no idea how to do that. And so the bottom line is if we were transported 30,000 years without our technical gadgetry, how would we appear to those people? Ironically, they would look at us and probably call us some sort of howling barbarian.
Very true, very true. And John, maybe could you explain a little bit about, as far as you know, or we can tell about the mindset of oral people? You do write that oral people mythologize history and literate people historicize mythology. How did the ancients view the world?
Well, okay, so that is a huge question.
Yeah, sorry, it might be a loaded question, sorry.
and I have to say, if you ask that question to 100 academics, you'll get probably 100 different answers and maybe some stabs in the back. So, well, okay, so we have some limitations. There is a permanent epistemological divide between the oral world and the literate world. We do not remember how the oral world worked. So we have to try to reconstitute it. And of course, there are a few oral cultures that have survived in the 20th century, very few. And, you could argue that even they have been influenced by modern cultures, but there have been anthropologists who have entered into these oral societies, the few that are left, and have made some notes. And so we can reconstruct from those notes. We can reconstruct from ancient writings which talk about earlier traditions. But even all of that, we're looking at ancient oral society through, the lens of modern commentators of some form or another. So, we have to proceed cautiously. And, I basically admit ancient history is a calculation of probability. No one can speak in certainties. It turns out lots of historians do speak in certainties, and whenever I read those historians, I kind of roll my eyes and giggle a little bit at the naivete. But there you have it. So ultimately, we know this: oral peoples without writing are very concrete thinkers. And in order to pass down information from generation to generation, they have to build a different kind of printing press. So literate peoples have, we invented a printing press so that we can pass down words from generation to generation. Well, if you don't have words, how do you pass down your knowledge? They had a different kind of structure, a memory theater, if you will, and that was composed of different parts that oral peoples used. One, they told stories. So myth was part of their oral memory theater. Two, they performed those stories. Almost all myths are related to some sort of ritual cycle. And even this is hotly debated, though. I find arguments against the myth-ritual connection to be highly problematic. You go to Egypt, and all the panels of all the writing in every temple are all shorthand for a ritual that's going on. Every myth we know about Egypt, Osiris and Isis and Horus and Set, they all were shorthand for a ritual process. So they told stories, they performed myths and festivals, they created temples which encapsulated all of their belief systems. And of course, those temples, they could be caves or trees or standing stones. They often were reproductions of their idea of the cosmos. And my point that I write in my book, in which I find that is often missed in academic literature, is all these aspects of the oral memory theater were predicated upon a cosmology. And that, the cosmology underwrites these other things. So basically, when a star rose on a horizon, that told the people when to tell their story, when to perform their ritual and festival, when to go to their temple. And so as the stars rose and set throughout the season, the entire memory theater was laid out open to each oral civilization. So we call, this oral cosmology, this memory aspect, mnemonic aspect of oral cosmology is often called astral theology. But my point is this is fundamental to oral cognition. Oral peoples will always, they'll always be polytheistic. Orality and polytheism are cognitive partners. You cannot describe every attribute of nature using one divine principle. Monotheism is a product of literacy. Polytheism is a product of orality. And two, have to wed everything you want to remember to a physical object around you. Your nature is your dictionary, right? So they don't have a book to go look up an idea. They have to point to a mountain or a tree. And the most ubiquitous aspect of nature is the sky. So oral cosmology is really the printing press, the oral imprinting press of pre-literate peoples, of oral peoples. So I don't know. That's a lot of information. Do I still have you, Miguel?
Oh yeah, this is wonderful. So basically, what you're saying is, I don't know if I want to use the head of holistic or more integrative thinking. For example, if they saw a bear, they saw both God, food, and animal, shelter. That's how they thought, basically?
I think that they were very good. Oral peoples are very good at looking at something in nature and describing it by its functions, how it came to be, how it is implemented into the ecosystem and environment, how it is used. But very often, oral peoples believe that true reality existed in the stars, and so everything was an emanation from the heavenly realm, and so everything was assigned a sort of celestial archetypal nature to it, which they implemented in their theology. So that's I spent a whole chapter in my book talking about oral cosmology, and it's a dense subject. I don't know. You read the book. I try to write it for the average educated person, for an average undergrad person. Did I succeed? Did I succeed?
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. I thought you did, and you bring up a lot of good points, and of course you back it up with all these wonderful myths. And even I think at one point you say, well, these ancient people were just having fantasies and fiction with their myths. But as you point out, modern cosmologies are creating fiction and fantasy. We're stuck with the Big Bang myth. We're stuck with the idea that our minds are computers, which they really aren't. I mean, modern people are doing the same thing.
Yes. So this will be a point of contention, because I basically say in my book that all cosmologies in any society are the sort of cultural envelope in which we create our cultural imagination. And they are all predicated on metaphysics, on philosophy. In fact, this is a point Karl Popper, the eminent historian of science, makes in his famous book, The Structure of Scientific Thought, or The Logic of Scientific, whatever that book is called. He says that all cosmologies are philosophical. And so, is the Big Bang Theory philosophical? Well, of course it is. It's informed by, observational experimental data, but the bottom line is, it is predicated on huge assumptions that we have to have absolute faith in. All cosmologies, as I write in my book, always begin one step after in the beginning, right? Because, the Big Bang Theory begins with this original singularity in which all the matter of the universe exists. Well, where did that come from? And how did it get there? And why did it explode or expand? And, so these questions are unanswerable, and they probably always will be unanswerable. And as a result, we will always be remaking the universe. And interestingly enough, what we think about the universe turns out very often to be what we think about ourselves, and vice versa. And so our view of ourself, of what humanity is, of our destiny, is always tied up in our view of the cosmos.
And John, aren't we pretty much hardwired to be spiritual, to look at the stars? I think one example, and I might be saying this wrong, is that the site in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, and it's found that the first thing that happens is the temple, is the observatory to look at the stars, and then civilization goes out from there. Yeah. There's two parts to that question. Are we hardwired for spiritual, religious concepts? There are lots of people who say yes. I mean, they're looking for the God gene. Some biologists have claimed they found the God gene. I'm not a biologist, so I really can't say. What I can say is, finite beings in an infinite environment, we will always be creating a metaphysical structure, which eventually will always turn into a religious body, a religious construct. So that's my view of that. As far as the creation of ancient civilization, well, here's something else that oral peoples had to do. They had to create civilization, right? And by modern definition, civilization is the ancient city-state, which appears apparently out of nowhere in Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium BCE. We still don't know much about any of that, but we do know that when oral peoples colonize a new territory, the first thing they do is they cosmicize it. They create boundaries which are a model of their view of the cosmos. They create an altar or a standing pillar, or they go to a tree, and that is a representation of the axis mundi, the center of the cosmos, and they begin creating
their society around this sort of cosmic ideology. We have totally lost this kind of sensibility in the modern culture. I mean, you have to understand that in oral society, you have to keep a calendar. And in order to keep a calendar, automatically you have to know the stars. And so it's, again, just a natural byproduct of orality that people are linked with the cosmos. They're always seeing which star is rising on the horizon before or after the sun. That'll tell them when to plant. That'll tell them, when harvest season is. That'll tell them, it tells them all sorts of things. It also, they encode their festivals with it, so it tells them when to perform their rituals. And so automatically they begin calculating the measurement of the sky as an integral part of the creation of their civilization. We know, since writing was invented and we have a printed calendar, we no longer have to do that. And as a matter of fact, the reason why I believe most academics kind of miss this whole cosmological fundament beneath mythological constructs is because we've forgotten all the. We can't even see the sky anymore. We live in urban areas where you look up and you see a couple stars and nobody knows what anything is. I do cite a jaywalking, the Tonight Show. Jay Leno. This is one of my pokes in the eye of our modern culture. He went to the graduation at UCLA, right? They're one of the top 25 universities in the country. People were graduating with bachelor's and master's degrees, and he asked them, simple questions. How many moons does the Earth have, and how long does it take for the Earth to orbit around the sun? And, really basic questions. And the answers were hilarious. They just were bizarrely off. And, you can always ask, well, how many correct answers did he edit out? But the truth of the matter is most people are clueless about the cycle of the skies, and even very educated, smart people are clueless because it's no longer in our sort of periphery of vision. And so I think when you begin studying ancient religion, ancient mythology, the first thing you have to do is learn the sky. And I didn't know that. I had to come to that conclusion after years of reading and research, and one day I had this depressing notion that I could not do any more academic study until I took some time off and learned the stars, learned how they worked, because I didn't know any of it. And so I did that. I'm kind of, maybe I'm a little OCD. I started by making my own telescope from scratch. And of course, most people in the ancient world didn't use a telescope. I'd say all people in the ancient world didn't use the telescope, but there are these crystal rock lenses that have been found dating back, a couple millennium BCE. You could argue that they had some rudimentary form of optics, but the bottom line is I had to take a year and a half and educate myself while doing my studies, and that really was an eye-opener for me, and it opened a lot of interpretive channels for my work with mythology.
And again, your book, Mythos and Cosmos, has a lot of wonderful myths, and you approach them very well and bring a lot of insights. One of the myths that seems to be one of the most fascinating myths is that of the flood myth. And as you point out, it's far more than the old Gnostic idea of these angry gods wanting to punish human beings just to be cruel. What exactly is behind these flood myths?
Well, first off, Miguel, I want to say the angry gods get a bad rap. I mean, look, if you were an angry god and you looked down and saw what human beings were doing every day, wouldn't you want to kill them?
Probably, yeah.
So, yeah, the flood myth, speaking of a year and a half journey, I took about a year and a half to collect as many scraps of flood mythology that I could find out of various libraries. And of course, I'm collecting hand-me-downs from hand-me-downs, so again, problematic. But, the earliest version of a flood myth we have is in a Babylonian text, the Epic of Gilgamesh. It predates the Bible, predates the Noah story by centuries. The epic in written form goes back to, segments of it go back to 1900 BCE. The oral form, goes back probably 1,000 years before that, if not 2,000 or 3,000 years before that, and whatever, variation that happened throughout the centuries. The Epic of Gilgamesh has a really interesting story of the flood. So what happens is, and most of your listeners probably know, but Gilgamesh descends to the underworld. He has a friend named Enkidu, and Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is so inconsolate, he wants to bring Enkidu back to life, and so he wants to find the secrets of immortality. And the only way you can find the secrets of immortality is to descend into the underworld where the secrets are kept. And this is a general feature in all underworld mythologies around the world. The secrets of life are kept in the womb of death. So Gilgamesh has to descend to the underworld, and there's all these adventures that he has to go through. And to make a long story shorter, he finally arrives at the bottom of the underworld and meets the only mortal who is granted immortality. His name is Utnapishtim. The name, sort of means the far distant one. And Gilgamesh then asks him, how do I obtain eternal life? This is the kind of the apex of the entire epic cycle. At least by the first millennium BCE, this is the apex of the entire epic cycle. How do I find eternal life? And Utnapishtim says, I will reveal to you a secret of the gods. And so, at this point, we're at the edge of our chair wondering, how do we obtain eternal life?
Where's the formula? Yeah, give it to me.
Yeah, what's the formula? I'll pay $25 for it. And then Utnapishtim does something strange. He tells Gilgamesh a myth. He tells him the flood story. This is the answer. The flood story is the answer to the question, how do I obtain immortality? Well, of course, this makes no sense. And, modern scholarship to this day, therefore, interprets this in this way. Modern scholars, for the most part, believe that the flood story was inserted into the Epic of Gilgamesh, sort of ad hoc. They had this flood story, they had this story of Gilgamesh, and someone long ago said, well, what are we going to do with this flood story? I know, let's put it here in the Epic of Gilgamesh at this point. So it's sort of an arbitrary ad hoc addition and accretion that didn't originally belong in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So that is the modern mainstream academic point of view. Well, I read these theories, and of course, a lot of myths don't make sense. So it shouldn't surprise us that the flood story being the answer to how do I find immortality. I mean, of course, a lot of myths don't make sense. That didn't make sense. I didn't know what to do with it. I actually wrote down on a Post-it note, what if Utnapishtim's answer was the correct one? I wrote that question down on a Post-it note, and I put it on my computer monitor, and it sat there for a year. And in fact, eventually it got covered over by other Post-it notes, and I had totally forgotten about it until one day I was reading the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I don't know if you do this, Miguel, but if you ever get bored, you pick up the Egyptian Book of the Dead, you start reading. I mean, how pathetic is that? So I was reading Faulkner's translation of the Papyri of Ani, Book of the Dead, and in chapter 175, I about fell out of my chair when I read that when Ani descended into the underworld, the sun god Ra was, granting him the secrets of immortality, and a flood story was told. Chapter 175 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Faulkner's translation. So when I read that, I went through all my Post-it notes until I found my question, what if Utnapishtim's answer was the correct one? And I put that front and center, and this was a corresponding evidence that perhaps the flood story was the correct answer to that question. And that got me going on a search for finding any other possible connections. And it turns out, once I had the connection, I started seeing connections everywhere. And actually, it was in front of me the whole time. It turns out almost every flood myth in every ancient culture is told in conjunction with the creation story. So in one aspect, the flood story is an explanation to oral peoples how things are born anew. So things get created, but you look around, things die. How are they born anew? Well, on a cosmic scale, they're born anew through the flood. So the raison d'etre of the flood story itself is rebirth. And as you read flood stories all around the world, from the Americas to Africa and Europe and Australia, there are heavy themes of rebirth and resurrection in these flood stories. What shocked me, though, and by the way, this is about the same time I was doing all my studying of astronomy. What shocked me is in most of these flood stories, the flood came from the celestial world. It wasn't a geological flood. And somehow I had missed that of years of reading these flood stories. I just didn't put those dots together. And for the most part, many of these flood stories are celestial floods. And of course, I didn't know how to explain that either. And so I spent a lot of time reconstituting some of the celestial motifs. There were certain stars in the sky, actually, that societies in the ancient Near East and ancient Greece associated with the flood, and also associated with resurrection, with rebirth. And so, as one example that I list in my book, there is no celestial motif in the biblical narrative. The Bible has been decosmologized thoroughly. The biblical Jewish scribes who wrote it down made sure that happened. And so there is only one hint in the biblical narrative of a remnant of a celestial motif, and that is when, after the flood occurs, Yahweh comes down to Noah and says, maybe that was a bad idea. I didn't mean to kill so many people. As a token that I'm never going to do this again, I'm going to put a bow in the sky, and this will be our token that I'm not going to be an angry Gnostic god and wipe out everyone at a whim. And so, of course, Jewish and Christian tradition interprets that bow as a rainbow because there's only one kind of bow that can exist in the sky, and that's a rainbow. Turns out that's wrong. It's completely wrong. You look at the Babylonian creation epic, which also recounts the flood story. They're wed together. Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the world by using a war bow, a bow and arrow bow. And after he defeats Tiamat, he hangs his bow in his temple, which is a representation of the cosmos. He's hanging his bow in the sky. Well, it turns out this bow is clearly identified in astronomical tablets as a constellation. So the bow that's hung in the sky as a token is a group of stars. Well, it turns out the Egyptians have this bow constellation also associated with floodwaters. The Chinese have it. The Babylonians have it. I went through several different sources and discovered that there are all kinds of connections between a bow and arrow, a flood, and the secrets of immortality. We find this in the Book of Enoch. We find it in the Labors of Heracles. We find it in the Ramayana, in the Hindu story of Rama. It's everywhere. And this hunting bow turns out to be a constellation, which the Greeks eventually turned into Argo, the celestial ship that sails the flood. It's a southern constellation. And in these ancient paradigms, such as the ancient Greco-Roman mysteries, in order to obtain immortality, one had to descend into the southern celestial regions. We find Heracles sailing upon the Eridanus, that's a southern constellation that leads to the Argo. We find Jason of the Argonauts sailing down the same constellation to find the secrets of life. And so you get all these connections with the flood story being a template of how one journeys through the stars to find the secrets of a renewed life. So that's just one example in my book of where I take a traditional myth and I show how there is a large different ideology, at least by the mid-second millennium BCE, underwrites it, and that our traditional interpretation of a worldwide geologic flood was not the ancient interpretation. It may have been for peoples, but that there were other more esoteric interpretations that belong to the cosmology and cult of the people.
Yeah, as you write, it was an initiation into the underworld. It's about the eternal cycle of death and rebirth on different levels, because they saw things on different levels.
Yeah.
And John, so basically, for example, what we've lost in moving forward, like Willis Barnstone, the great translator, he was editor of the Gnostic Bible, he said that even Christian texts had to be performed, had a ritual behind it, whether it was Thunder the Perfect Mind or the Gospel of John. These things were part of a theater that reflected the theater above. Would you agree with this? And does it mean that even with Christianity we've lost a lot?
Well, that is a very good question, and I would say yes. In fact, I would say definitely yes. Truth of the matter is, Miguel, no one knows anything about the early Christian sects or church, or the first and second century Christians have vanished from history. We have almost no writing. The Christianity with which we are familiar, the early Christianity with which we are familiar, really was Proto-Catholicism, 4th century and forward, and we nobody has any idea what the earliest Christians believed. So that kind of is problematic for Christians, don't you think?
A bit, yeah.
But that the same can be said with every religion. No one has any idea what the earliest Israelites believed. But I write in my book that the Law of Moses may be a late adaptation, and that the earlier theology of Israel would be far more in common with their Egyptian and Near Eastern neighbors than it would have anything to do with modern Judeo-Christian traditions. That is certainly true. And it's true for Hinduism. It's true for any ancient religion or religion that's adopted from ancient constructs. So we do have some writings of some of the early church fathers that do talk about how rituals were performed in early Christianity that dealt with ascending to the heavens. And I write a little bit about this in my book when I write about the heavenly chorus. I don't know if you remember that, but
I do, yeah.
Many of these myths, were ritualized, and oral peoples will dance their myths. This is a great way, by the way, to remember things, is to sing it and dance it. All oral societies are play-acting societies, and drama, right? Our word drama is a Greek word which means to act, and it's cognate with dromenon, a Greek word which means to act in a ritual. Ancient dramas were ritual performances. So these ancient rituals were dramatized and danced, and we do have some citations from some early Christian writers that talk about how the Christian initiate, after baptism, performed a dance where they ascended into heaven. Well, this is very similar to certain constructs in the Greco-Roman mysteries. The mysteries of Attis required a dance and song. Attis actually ascends into the heavens by overcoming a lion using nothing but his musical lyre. Orpheus enters the underworld by using his musical lyre. Even the Egyptians in the pyramid texts, in order to enter into the underworld, the pyramid texts themselves say a dance has to be performed, and there has to be the watchers who dance for the deceased. So this is a tradition that goes back beyond the first dynasty of Egypt. So And of course, the Egyptian journey into the next world is a celestial one, so we find similar motifs happening in the Greco-Roman mysteries. We find hints of it in early Christianity. But how that played out, no one knows, because we just simply do not know what the earliest Christians believed. This is, the problem with having our Gospels written centuries after the fact by educated Greeks who didn't even know Jesus, and the whole problem with how Christianity emerged in its written style, as opposed to probably its earliest oral roots. It's interesting that Jesus teaches almost exclusively by telling stories. He's teaching an oral people. And so, while scholars recognize this, very often it's forgotten that almost all oral stories of a theological kind had rituals attached to them. And you don't get that in an English translation. Those are lost.
Yeah, I agree. Well, maybe the aliens came down and gave us the story of Jesus. You never know. But, John, the first time I heard you was at my friend's Mythos Milwaukee show. And I enjoyed how you talked about how you being an academic and enjoying mythology really hasn't affected your personal views. I mean, I'm sort of the same way. I remember as a kid asking my mom, I was raised Catholic, and saying, Mom, what's the deal? What's this talking snake and flood myth and all this other weirdness? And my mom, who was a devout Catholic, simply said, oh, those are just ancient myths of people. I was off to the races because I said, I want more of this myth. These stories are awesome now that so how about you? How's that affected your life?
Well, it has immensely enriched it. In one aspect, I do appreciate Campbell and Jung for their psychological take on myth. And it's interesting. I myself have very mythic dreams. I dream in myth. And so that has helped me profoundly. But, look, I was raised an Orthodox Mormon. And, in full disclosure, I'm still a practicing Mormon. But in Orthodox Mormonism, I was taught a somewhat literal interpretation of the scriptures, which never made sense to me as a kid. And so I began rather early on in my teenage years reading sacred texts of all the world's religions. And you don't start doing that before you start running into mythic stories. The Mahabharata is an example. I picked up a condensed version of that. I haven't read all 26 volumes of it. So, it's got all these stories of the Pandavas and gods and battles and just really weird mythic stuff. And I had no idea what I was reading, but it just really increased my curiosity, and so that really got me into studying ancient mythology. And it's a long, circuitous journey, but as I return to my religious canon, my religious tradition, I find that you take away the literalism that has been ascribed to it, basically because of tradition, and you start applying to it these ancient oral ideas, and the text comes alive. It opens up. It, for me, is more spiritually powerful. And, for other people, it is not. It's, they learn that the stories aren't actually historical the way they've been taught, and so they lose faith and they leave the faith. I'm just not that guy. I learned that they actually were not historical, and I say, cool. What else can I learn?
No kidding.
And so, there you have it. Ancient mythology is oral religion. Lots of academics would disagree with that, but for the most part, myth is somebody else's religion. If you're really interested in discovering a higher self, or a divine life, enlightenment, however you want to put it, then everything has to be on the table. And you It doesn't mean you believe everything in, everything out, but it means that you rejoice in every approach to truth, and you try to see that approach through the eyes of the people who are creating it. And so, I have this degree in comparative myth and religions, and that's essentially what I did. Is I studied religions and mythologies in an attempt to see how they saw it in their historical context, and that's only enriched my own religious views.
Yeah, and you start discovering, like you said, a lot of richness. I found it certainly in the Catholic Church and later on studying the Gnostics. And even as I study, for example, I think Joseph Smith might have been closer to the true Christianity than most would ever think. I mean, when you read Margaret Barker's The Great Angel and how Yahweh was this great angel, the idea of man becoming divine, the idea of deconstructing the Old Testament and finding new insights as the Gnostics, as the Sethians did. That's what Joseph Smith was doing. He was creating great myth, which in a way was touching on the primordial myths.
That's true. That's certainly how I see it. It's certainly how Harold Bloom sees it. That's certainly how a lot of Mormons see it, and that's certainly how a lot of Orthodox Christians see it, and that's why they don't forgive us. Mormonism is a heretical sect of Christianity, and a lot of people still call it a cult, because Joseph Smith basically took the old creeds of Catholic and Protestant creeds of Christianity and he turned them on their head. He introduced a radical different cosmology that in some ways was very hermetic and very Gnostic. In some ways it's not, but in many ways it was. Mormon cosmology teaches that the human soul is uncreated. It's co-equal with God. It's part of the original divine spark, right? And that Mormon religious life is experiential. It's really not predicated on creeds and doctrines. It's the searching for internal enlightenment through the Spirit. These are very non-orthodox applications of Christian ideas. And of course, Joseph Smith went out and found golden tablets of truth, and he used ceremonial magic, and there were angelic visitations, and he wrote pseudepigraphic texts, and he introduced masonry, and instead of building a barn with a cross on it, he created a temple with cosmological symbols, and the central ritual was the sacred marriage. I mean, this is all very hermetic.
Oh yeah.
In that respect. So those are the things that actually I like about the Mormon religion. The things that Orthodoxy accuses us of heresy is what makes me a Mormon. So I don't know. Maybe that's just what that says something about myself. I will say that like all religions, they go through cycles, and all religion is a process of assimilation and adaptation. That's certainly true of Judaism, certainly true of early Christianity. It's true of all sects, all religions. And every once in a while, in this process of assimilation and adaptation, you get a radical reformation. That's what Buddha did to Hinduism. That's what Jesus did to Judaism. And that's what Joseph Smith did to Christianity, or at least American Christianity. And so this sort of radical individualism and individual enlightenment that was part of the Mormon ethos, Mormon mythos, really is its vitality. There are aspects of modern Mormon culture that have sort of retreated into a more mainstream Protestant cultural and ideology, and that has the upside of, I guess, normalizing us to the rest of the world. For me personally, I think it's a tragedy. So, there's that aspect of it too.
Well, all we can do is keep looking at the stars, but I think that's all the time we have today, John. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your wonderful book, Mythos and Cosmos.
Well, thank you, Miguel. Thanks for having me. It's great discussion.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here or there. Join my Patreon campaign. Buy some of me reality-dispanding, mind-expanding books like Voices of Gnosticism, Heretic, or Stargazer. Subscribe to our archive of past shows. Your continued donations keep this Red Pill cafeteria open. The various avenues to assist me are found at thegodabovegod.com. Support alternative media away from the few corporations that own all mainstream media. I should mention that I am an Amazon.com affiliate, so any books you order from thegodabovegod.com grant me a kickback. In fact, if you order anything, whether it's clothes, appliances, or sex toys, click through the site and I will get a kickback from that as well. Even if you don't order anything advertised at thegodabovegod.com. Much appreciation to you, Knights of Valis, Shining Crazy Diamonds, and Rainbows in the Dark who support this blasphemy on a weekly basis. Write your own gospel and live your own myth.